Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webcast. I'm Sarah Dawson from Western Alumni, and I'm excited to spend this time with you where we'll be able to talk with our expert, Dr. Colin King, on the K-12 return for learning. Dr. King, you can go ahead and turn on your video now. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. For those of you who sent us your questions through social media, that was really helpful. We'll try to get to as many of those as you can. And for those of you on Zoom, you're able to send us your questions live, and we'll try to ask Dr. King as many questions as we can tackle today. If you're joining us on Facebook, you can also comment, and we'll get to those questions too. Dr. Colin King is an associate professor at Western's Faculty of Education. He's also the director of the Child and Youth Development Clinic at Western University. We're really happy to have you here today, Dr. King, as one of our renowned experts in child and adolescent mental health. I hope that you can shed a lot of light and a lot of expertise on this really important topic that I know a lot of us are wrestling with right now. So welcome and thanks for joining us.
Great. Well, thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the very generous introduction there. I'm so happy that so many people have registered and are listening in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's get started because we do have a lot of questions to get through. I know one of them right now is as we spend time thinking about preparing for the back to learning. We know parents and other adults that spend time with kids play a really influential role in helping them cope with all kinds of stressors day to day. But do you think you can share with us some of the ways we can help build feelings of safety and security when so much right now is uncertain?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think that's a great question to start off with because I think it's really important in the beginning for us to acknowledge just really how difficult time this has been for a whole number of people and whole different groups of people, including parents. You know, the phrase I've heard a number of different times here is, you know, we may be all in the same storm, but we're certainly not all in the same boat. And I think that's absolutely true. And we've seen some of the data coming out now about the inequities across groups along race or socioeconomic status and gender, is that it has been a disproportionate effects on different people. And I think that's really important to understand, to validate, and to acknowledge that the feelings that we have right now are very legitimate. That many of us are feeling very overwhelmed or struggling with feelings of grief and uncertainty, and that's okay. So I think that would be my first takeaway, if kind of maybe nothing else from the webinar, is for parents really to have some of that permission to check in with themselves about how they're feeling, to really be thinking about some of that self-compassion about what the last 5.5 months have been for them, and to make space for some of those really kind of difficult feelings. Because I really do feel that as we talk more today, that if we want to kind of support the kids, we really need to be supporting the parents. Yes. And acknowledging some of those feelings, giving ourselves permission to feel those uncomfortable feelings. First of all, what will be really important as a first step.
Yeah, absolutely. And so on that note, as parents are trying to kind of figure out where they are, what's your advice to parents around their own stress and anxiety as they start to work with their children on getting them off to the best start as we move into the new academic year?
That's great. Well, I do think our first part is trying to be intentional about finding some time and space where we can really reflect on how we are feeling. And I think for many parents, it's a whole cascade of emotions, and really trying to be intentional about trying to identify what is it about our return to learning that is really causing some of those intense feelings. Is it about the health element and the physical safety? Is it about all the changes that have been coming our way? One of the techniques that we might be talking about here today is this idea of being able to actually hold some of these simultaneous feelings kind of at the same time. This idea of the dialectical, these two opposing truths of that I can feel uncertain or feel stressed about our return to learning, and I can do my best to feel calm and confident for my kids. So I think that's really a first step, is trying to kind of dig down about, what are some of the concrete things that are causing us some of these really intense feelings. And we'll be talking about probably with kids as well, but trying to kind of separate those. One of the distinctions I often make is, what's kind of a stressor and a problem versus what is more of a worry. And I think a lot of the space, myself included as a parent right now, is in that kind of stress category, is that there are a number of kind of problems and things we're trying to wrestle with right now that are causing us stress and anxiety and grief. And it's important to be as detailed and knowledgeable about that as we can.
Yeah, and so what would you recommend for parents to do? I mean, it sounds like this is an exercise that they can walk through personally, but also that they can perhaps help their children walk through as well. Does that entail making a list, or what are your recommendations for that?
Yeah, well, I think, again, on the parent caregiver side, I think it's really important for us to be attending first to our own feelings. So I think setting aside of a dedicated amount of time, maybe that's first thing in the morning before the kids wake up or after they go to bed, but really trying to tune in again with how we're feeling. Because it's only, again, once we have that kind of knowledge and awareness that we can really then move to what are some of the concerns or worries kind of for my kids. So I do think having some of that dedicated time, both on the parent side, is really important. But as we're getting back to our return to learning, to have some of those intentional conversations with our children and youth to bring them into the conversation. Once we kind of figure out where we're at on that kind of roadmap, then we can begin to figure out where our kids are at and what are some of the questions or concerns that they might have.
It reminds me of when you fly, they give you the safety run through right as you're getting started, and they always say to put on your own oxygen mask before you assist others. So I think what I'm gathering is that it's important that we take time to really figure out where we are, even if it's just a couple of minutes. So many competing priorities and worries and concerns, particularly with families that are balancing so much right now. Even putting yourself in the bathroom for a couple of minutes just to take a pulse check and take a breather, so that you can then address those maybe same worries and concerns with your kids. And so as parents begin to have those conversations with their children or with those in their care, how might a parent, what kind of language would a parent use, and how might a parent or educator work with kids as they are noticing that the stress, and are really preparing them to feel a little bit of safety and security as they go into an environment, whether that be at home learning or in the classroom, that's just different.
Well, and I think your phrasing there, Sarah, around putting on your own oxygen mask, I think is a real important takeaway too. Because again, I think it's really only through helping ourselves first that we can be available for our kids and our students that way. And one of the distinctions I am often making is, again, is this kind of an adult problem, or is this a concern that I really need to share with my child or student and really involve them as part of that? So I think, again, that distinction is really important. But as a first step, I think the first one is, as much as we're making space and validating the emotions on the parent caregiver and caring adult side, I think it's absolutely the same for our kids and students we're working with, is to acknowledge that there's probably a whole host of different feelings that children are having about returning back to learning, whether, again, that's in home or in person, and that it's complicated, that they may be having feeling really uncertain about coming back in September, but at the same time feeling really excited to come back and looking forward to the change. So I think some of that normalization of the experiences coming back, of things looking a little bit different, and acknowledging that is really important. And because I think certainly for the first several weeks as we're returning back here, is we need to be having those conversations in ways that are of course developmentally appropriate, but to be explicit and label the feelings that we have, and really working together about this new school year and what we're excited for. What are some of the things in our journey together here as we begin that we can begin to focus on and create together?
So in psychology, there's, the phrase you might be familiar with, I'm sure you are, but what we resist persists. So my takeaway from your advice really is the importance of acknowledging feelings, particularly in ourselves, but in kids too. So when you start to notice something, that validation, the naming the feeling, the acknowledging that it's there, that in and of itself is a substantial strategy to help move forward, despite the fact that we might not be able to do anything to solve for that particular concern. But restating it is helpful.
Absolutely. I think of the phrase, name it to tame it, where we're again being, using open-ended questions with our students and kids and really being curious about how they're feeling and being that sounding board. If I think we've all had those experiences with, perhaps a friend where, we're not looking for necessarily the problem to be solved or the answer, but we're looking really to be understood, to be validated, and just how much that can be a relief and to have that recognition about how we're feeling.
Yeah, fantastic. So I'm wondering, as we start this return to learning, there are a lot of questions that we have. And as it turns out, it feels like we're going to have to start things before we have the answers to many of our questions. How do you suggest we prepare ourselves to get started in the best way possible, despite the fact that we have to get going before we know everything?
Yeah, that's I think that's a real reality for many of us right now. And I think, speaking as a parent here, as part of that, one of my real takeaways is trying to think about some of the strategies that I've already been using over the past 5+ months as part of navigating some of this kind of uncertainty. I'm in my corner here really trying to think about some of the things that I can control, some of the strategies, routines, things that I can take to help increase my sense of safety and security, but also recognizing some of the things that right now that are uncertain, that we don't know about. And really trying to focus again some of the things that I do have some of that control and mastery over. I think what we've seen in speaking with a lot of parents over the past 5 months here is really that roller coaster of emotions across weeks and days and sometimes even hours. And I think beginning to set some of our expectations a little bit about this new school year. And I'd be shocked if there's not some more curveballs that might come our way as part of the fall term, but focusing on some of those steps and tasks that we have been able to kind of make it through at this point, 5.5 months into, because it is going to be tough entering this next phase.
Yeah, absolutely. So I know kids ask a lot of questions, and I think this is maybe one, but that a lot of people have is, am I going to get sick? As a parent, when you're asked a direct question, I think our instincts are probably to soothe a student or a child and to help them feel better and to take away that worry. Would you suggest going down that path to soothe that, to brush it off, or would you have a more direct conversation about a concern?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I do think some of the stance you take will be, as kind of developmentally appropriate for your child. Some of the ideas that I'm thinking about here, as much as we can, to be honest and truthful with kids. And in that question there, I think I'd be really curious about, what the child's thinking about. What does getting sick mean? So tell me a bit more about that, or what the worry's worried about as part of that. Is that getting sick and being really ill? Does that mean not being able to go to school? Does it mean parents getting sick? Because I do think, again, going back to that distinction we made a little bit earlier about, is this a problem or is this a worry, can be really helpful in those instances.
Yeah, and so how would someone tackle, once they determine if it's a problem or a worry, My guess is a worry can be soothed. It's understanding the feeling behind it. A problem can sometimes be solved. What does distinguishing that, how does that help inform how someone would move forward?
So, well, I think about, some of the questions that are in the more problem category, or these are some of those concrete steps that we can take, that we can, as a result of the concern, begin to solve or put into place next steps. So, if I think about that, so what would happen if I did get sick? We could talk again, you know your child or student best, but to talk about, so what would be kind of the protocol in terms of next steps there? How have we handled getting sick before? What would that kind of look like? And on the worry side, often when worries are getting in the way here, it's often very future oriented. It's taking kind of that small problem, which we are acknowledging is a very legitimate, valid concern, but magnifying that to certain degrees and amplitudes there that are really saying to the child that, if this happened, that you wouldn't be able to manage it, that you'd have no control, and that we couldn't handle it. And again, going back to that problem side, I think it is quite appropriate and legitimate to talk about, so what would happen if someone gets sick in the family? How would we deal with that? How would we manage that? So I do think that's an important concern to address for kids, but I also think it's important to be curious about what's really kind of driving some of that questioning too.
Yeah, absolutely. I love your suggestion around incorporating the child into the problem solving. That in and of itself helps give a certain level of control, being involved in the process and being involved in the conversation at a greater level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for, a lot of students coming in this fall is that, they do have some very legitimate concerns and questions here about how things are going to play out. And I think, with the knowledge that we have at this time is we want to address that. And I'm often making a distinction for kids about, again, what are Colin's questions and what are the questions Colin's anxiety has about this? We want to be able to respond and involve the child in some of that very proactive kind of problem solving and adaptive to show that, hey, we can deal with it. But maybe when it's on the worry side, maybe we'll use a different set of strategies to deal with some of that real bothersome anxiety that won't leave us alone.
Yeah, that's a really good segue, because I'm thinking a lot of people might be interested in hearing about the difference between stressors and anxiety. And that you said you would use different strategies for one versus the other. So can you talk to us a little bit about sort of normal stress versus a level of anxiety that's getting in the way?
Sure. Well, I think we do often use those terms interchangeably, but I am often thinking about them as being different things. Stresses are often external to us. They often involve some sort of problem-solving element that we can be involved with. They tend to be more kind of acute, that there's a stressor for a certain amount of time, and that stressor tends to kind of mobilize us. If I think about getting ready for the webinar today, I logged on early. It was mobilizing in the sense that it was productive. It was really trying to get me to deal with some of that level of stress. And that's a very healthy, important way of coping with that. I think when we start to see problematic anxiety getting in the way, I'm often seeing that productive system shut down. So I think about the 3 F's, the fight, flight, or freeze in response to anxiety. And for many kids and adults too, where we're not able now to move forward because of some of the worry or that future-oriented problem that's, again, really taken us from the concern in the moment right here and transported us to the future where we're not coping.
Yeah.
So I think, again, one of the lines sometimes we use with kids is about a more detailed description leads to a more informed prescription. And I don't mean kind of prescription medication wise, but prescription about how we're going to deal with it. So I'm often encouraging parents to be really curious and, talking about, okay, so what's tough about that? What's hard about that? What is anxiety saying would happen next? A lot of, again, follow-up open-ended questions here to really get at, again, is this more of a worry or something that we can deal with in the moment and put some of those strategies in place.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. I think that's really helpful. As we start to think about transitioning, back into learning, I think one of the things that many of us are craving is a sense of normalcy, a sense of routine again. And, as I think what many of us are expecting is we're just going to like jump into things and feel like that again. How can we perhaps prepare ourselves and prepare our children for things not to be as they remembered as we go into, our return to learning transition?
Yeah. Well, and that's a great question, Sarah, because I do think that, I mean, this September is going to look a little bit different for sure, so whether you're at home or in person. But I might start off with some of the things that we know at this point in time that will be similar. Obviously some of the setup might be different, but some of the things that will be familiar around routines, about some of the practices that we're using about going back to September on, if this was a typical fall, what might we do to get ready? So again, maybe we're already starting to have some conversations about return to learning and maybe some of those next steps that we typically do as a family or for kids about kind of getting ready. But I think it's important too for when we're talking with kids about talking about kind of at this time, is that we do know that this isn't a plan that's been hammered in stone and is set, but here's what we know kind of at this time. And I think building in that expectation of some change or that things could look a little bit different as we kind of move along is really important too.
I guess something that you said earlier in the conversation was around relying on the things that we've already done or we may have already practiced. So when we're having those conversations about things that might look the same and, helping have that dialogue around what might look different and new routines, we think about things we've practiced over the past several months, which is like we're hand washing in different ways than perhaps we did prior to March. And so those things that we've been practicing will also carry with us moving forward into September. Same with some learning. So those students who are returning to learning, but they're returning virtually, maybe practicing some things that they have had some experience with. And so incorporating those two pieces could be useful.
Absolutely, and I think it's, as much as we can maybe to take stock of over the last couple months here about what has gone well, if some of the emergency remote learning there, certainly in the spring and into the summer there about, knowing what we know now, can we build in some of those routines or how do we get ready knowing that we're going back to that? Or again, if it's returning back to the in-person learning, again, what do we typically do in a regular September to maybe get ready? And I think all those normalization of some of those practices and routine, knowing that there could be uncertainty, but hey, some of these things we've done before and we can do it again.
Yeah, for sure. We have a question on Zoom that I'd like to ask. It's about engaging children in discussions and questions, listening to their fears. Mary Lou asks, what suggestions do you have for parents who have their own hearing and communication concerns? Do you know of any services or clinicians that are available to help?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do know that one of the things I'm often turning to for all families are often different storybooks and different videos as a way of helping meet kids kind of where they're at. And I think especially around anxiety, the more we talk about it and demystify some of its power is really kind of important for kids. In terms of individual kind of agencies and clinicians, I would suggest kind of reaching out with those kind of particulars in mind. I do know a number of practitioners and agencies there that are getting ready for these types of concerns and conversations with families as we go back to kind of return to learning. But there are a number of different resources and websites there, I think, that kids can peruse and read, and we can begin to have some initial conversations or discussions anyways around anxieties starting there.
Yeah, I should tell everybody that Colin, you were kind enough to put together a resource list. It's fairly comprehensive, and we are going to be sharing that out after the webcast. It'll be posted on our website with this recording, and some of the resources will be available alongside the corresponding questions on social media when we're finished today, so parents can follow up that way. We have another question from Facebook about getting educators ready to go back into the classroom. I think there's a lot of educators that are really concerned. They're doing things differently than they've ever been asked to do them before. Do you have any recommendations on what they might do to prepare for such a vast change?
Well, I think some of the ideas we already talked about, but I think first really kind of validating some of those feelings, and whether it's uncertainty or stress or grief and loss of some of the things that are going to be different are really important. I think being able to reach out, and perhaps it's with other educators, about this return to learning is also really important, to know that there's many of us who are going to be navigating these next steps together, and that we can do it together as a team. And I think, about some of the early days in the pandemic, whether it be, some of the first days of going to the grocery store for the first time, or, getting a haircut if you've done that, or some of those initial first steps, is that we acknowledge some of that uncertainty and some of that stress, and we take some of those baby steps forward anyways, in spite of some of that stress and anxiety. And I think what we can expect for many of us is that some of those early days in the first week or two are going to be more challenging. So how do we build in some of the self-care to make it through some of those tough days? And as we're further along, to reflect on the difference of where we are now 3 weeks in versus day 1 or day 2.
Yeah, we have a really specific question that I think is probably, one person's asked it, but I bet many of us are thinking about it. And it's about helping children with masks. Different jurisdictions have different rules and regulations around the age of the child wearing masks, but nonetheless, many are going to be needing to wear them. And for parents who are having a hard time getting their student to wear a mask, do you have any specific suggestions on how to talk through that, how to practice that to make it less panic-inducing?
Yeah. Well, I think, again, first step is really to normalize some of those feelings of, whether it's, annoyance of having to wear them, or discomfort, to gather some of those different feelings about how we're feeling about wearing masks. I think for younger kids especially, I think to be aware of our own emotions about how we're having those conversations. I know just even sometimes with my youngest, when he's picking up on some of my tone and regulation there, if it starts to become a bit of an emotionally charged topic, which again is much more likely to produce some of those no's and difficulty following through. But I think about a couple of ideas. I think about, especially with where we're at right now in the schedule, is some opportunities for practicing, to make it playful and fun. I know, again, in our house, we've, grabbed some stuffies now that are wearing masks that they never did before, and we're starting to do some of that practicing, whether it be lining up in the dollar store or to the grocery store, to do some of that normalization of us wearing them together when we're out and about doing things. And I'm also thinking about, again, some entry points. If we haven't been wearing them, where do we start? And perhaps that's doing some iPad or screen time and short little chunks there about wearing a mask, and talking about what that feels like, and praising, if we're able to wear that for 10 or 15 minutes, and then working up to longer durations. Maybe we're going for a walk together, or maybe we're standing in line for an ice cream cone as we're getting ready for that. Because I do think a lot of this is going to take some practice and routines and normalization of seeing other peers and other students wear it. And that's why I think it's really important for parents, educators, caring adults to be sending that message too, that, hey, this is just something new that we're doing now. And I know just recently I saw from our local public board a great video that talked about with kids, that showed kids wearing masks and some of the new routines that are going to be different this September. And again, I think that goes a long way to normalizing some of those concerns.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a question coming in from Facebook around any recommendations that you might have for students who are engaged in full remote learning, how to maintain ties to their community or even their home school.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I do think for those who are doing at-home learning, and some of those relationships and connections are really important. And again, I think this is a great opportunity to involve our child and youth in that process of problem solving together. You know, during the spring months, emergency remote learning there, you know, are there some pieces we can go back to? Or do we have to be a little bit more intentional about what that means moving forward once we know, what peers and friends are back at school for in-person learning, those who are learning from home? And also inviting some new possibilities that might come out of this too, about new friendships or new opportunities that come with some of the at-home learning.
Yeah.
But I think involving the child with their concerns and some of their creative ideas about what's important to them is, I think, really important as we move forward, thinking about next steps.
Yeah, I have teenagers on my mind. The high school students are having often in many jurisdictions a very different experience if they're either if they're at home remote learning or if they're in the classroom, but they're being asked to focus on one particular subject at a time for an extended duration of time. And so I think about the challenges that come with that on focus and the ability to persevere through maybe even a subject that you don't feel very confident in. The idea that many of them will be at home in isolation, not intentionally, but if they have parents who are working outside of the home, they might be on their own with an expectation to really focus and do work during that time. What can we do to help coach kids, either as educators and as parents, to refuel and focus and push through these hyper intense courses that are reduced in the amount of time that they're running?
Yeah, and this is going to be, a real new experience for many of us, and educators included. And I don't know if there's any firm ideas there other than to say I think we're going to figure it out together. And I think as we navigate the first several weeks and months together, I think that's a great opportunity for educators, parents, and our students to come together to identify some of those problems about how do I maintain that level of focus and motivation on one course. What are going to be some of the things that are going to be really important for me to keep working hard? And I know across a number of different settings and people I'm talking with is that relationships really are being made the priority in September, whether that's in-person learning or at-home learning. Relationships are really going to help us through this period of uncertainty, and some of those common concerns about solely focusing, say, on one course or making it through the amount of time are not just concerns for one child, but for many of us. And I think there's some really probably creative ideas that we can build in together to make it through.
Yeah, there's a question about what are some of those creative ideas that we might use to further personal, build relationships during this time.
Yeah, that's great. Well, and again, one of the mantras I've heard here is certainly connection before curriculum as part of that. I think to acknowledge some of the different feelings that were coming into the space together in September, whether that's, again, in person or at home learning, and forging individual connections with students, but also as a group. I mean, I know, again, from a parent lens here for my oldest, it was much easier to log on when he knew several of his friends were going to be online as well as part of that. So how do we forge connections between educator and parents and students, but also across groups? How do we get students to know each other over this virtual platform, or again, in-person learning that looks a little bit different? Thinking on the kind of more self-regulation side about the amount of time kind of learning from home. Again, I think that's something as a class that we can begin to think about, whether it be activity breaks or small rewards and other things that we can build into our schedule, so that we have that sense of predictability about what's coming up next and what to anticipate for the duration of that day.
Yeah, so that's something that that I wonder really does have a lot of importance around predictability.
Yeah.
Because there's so much uncertainty. Any opportunity that we have to lay things out and let students know and let our children know what's coming and what can be expected might counterbalance all the uncertainty that we're wrestling with day to day.
Absolutely, and if we're looking at something like a visual schedule, I would suggest maybe we're putting that on Microsoft Word, so that perhaps we have the flexibility there to move some things. But I think that sense of a routine and predictability can do a lot for our levels of stress. And for anxious kids, I'm often talking about that as a way to kind of turn down the thermostat when we're feeling stressed and anxious, right? These are just some of those strategies and routines that we can build in that can take some of the edge off. That we don't have to worry about that part because we have a sense of what that's going to look like, at least for kind of today or the next week or so.
Yeah, we've got a question from Zoom saying, thanks for sharing the pieces about younger children around masks and stuffies and those sorts of things were really, really helpful. Could we address teens and tweens who may not be as apt or keen on sharing their feelings? Are there any strategies that parents and educators can use for those age groups?
That's great, and I know that sometimes it's a little bit more challenging to start those conversations. I know on my end, I'm often inventing hypothetical or clients or students to say, here's some of the common questions or concerns that have come up, as we're entering this new phase. And again, really kind of normalizing that and bringing that out to talk about, again, kind of the range of feelings that we have about coming back in September and to that particular kind of mode of learning as well. And I'm also really often listening into what kids are sharing with other kids or teens and other teens there as well, and really trying to kind of listen into what might be behind some of the questions or the statements that they're sharing there too.
Yeah. Thinking about families that may already be working through issues and with children who are already wrestling with some anxiety and other mental health conditions, already in normal circumstances. And now so many things are uncertain. We are going into a very confusing and unpredictable environment, whether that's at home or in the classroom. And are there strategies that we can help these parents and families and educators with, in the chaos of all of it? What might we do?
Well, and we know it's been a really tough go for kids and families, and some of the stats, I'm thinking of a survey put out by Children's Mental Health Ontario, talking about 60% of parents have noticed changes in their child or youth during this time. I think as we're going back, I think about what we can do together to know that we're not in this alone, that I really believe it's always taken a village to support kids, and I really think that's going to be especially true this fall. And transitions are difficult at the best of times, September back of school being one of them. So, and I think for kids who already have a lot on their plate to begin to anticipate some of those bumps in the road and the roller coaster that's going to be in front of us. But I think some of it is to be intentional about, again, with it being August 27th and, different start dates across the province and world there as part of that, to maybe take a bit of time and be intentional about, let's reflect on kind of where we're at right now. What are some of the big concerns from kids and on the parent side, from my adult worries, that we really need to kind of think about that can help us with some of these small steps moving forward. That's one of the things that we know is a bit of an antidote to stress and anxiety is some of those small steps moving forward, not necessarily when we're comfortable, but actually in spite of some of these feelings of uncertainty and stress. So, what can we take as one small practical next step there that might feel like we're moving forward, even if it's a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Some things, sometimes a lot of very small things can make a huge impact on how we're feeling and how we're experiencing the world around us. I have a really good question around asking, what tips do you have to help reset expectations for the school year? So in the springtime, everyone went into emergency learning, and the expectations there were quite different. Knowing that we're moving into the fall, there are going to probably be different expectations for students. And what tips do you have to help students understand those, and to help parents work with their kids and help educators work with their students on these new expectations?
Yeah, whenever I'm thinking about expectations, Sarah, I'm often really listening in for some of the shoulds or oughts. I should be doing this, or I ought to be feeling this way, or I should be doing this thing or the other thing. And I think the first is really acknowledging that this September is going to be different. We're in the midst of, again, once in a lifetime, global pandemic, and that we're going to focus on some of the big things that are really going to provide that foundation for some of the subsequent learning that's going to happen later on in the year. So I think that's about connections and relationships. I think about that sense of security and routines for parents, educators, and students. There's a great line, Kevin Cameron, who does some trauma threat response training, but he talks about treating the big things big and the little things little. And I think some of the big things, especially for the first month here, is going to be some of those new routines and practices, and getting back into it after 6 months. And I think giving ourselves some permission and compassion that, maybe in the past I've been here or at this point in terms of my classroom or academics or parents, I thought we'd be in a routine by now. But that's okay, that to give some of that self-compassion that we're doing the best we can, certainly given these very challenging circumstances.
Yeah, we have a question around supporting students who are not going to be returning to the classroom. Is there anything that parents can do to help support their kids with a big change? So they might be having a different learning environment than some of their classmates or some of their playmates. Is there anything we can do to be helpful there?
Good question, because I do know that there's a sizable number of students and families that will be learning from home, and I think it's important to normalize that, as a family, we've made this decision, but there are many other families who've also made this decision, and we're going to be in a community doing some of that home learning with those students and educators. I think about some intentional time to go back and validate those feelings about what that might mean for the child. What are some of the changes or feelings about some of the at-home learning? You know, is it about some of those lost or some of the friendships looking a little bit different? Or there's some positive attributes about some of the at-home learning that we can talk about as well as we move forward. Again, that idea of, I think, really partnering with our kids, knowing that we can co-construct and co-create some of these contexts and next steps with them is going to be really important. And also to acknowledge that when we begin in September, that there's going to be a community of us coming together with some of these same concerns or same acknowledgement of some of the differences that that is going to be different compared to some of the in-person learning.
Yeah. Colin, it's 12:45. We have a couple more questions. Do we have time to take a few more questions before we wrap up?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. I know there are families that are still trying to make the decision between in-person or remote learning for their families. There's certainly some rationale behind each one. Can you give us some rationale behind each one with a socio-emotional, I guess, context for each one of those decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question, Sarah. And I think, you know, if there's one learning on my end, I think through this whole pandemic, it's that just how individual those experiences have been for each child, caregiver, and family. And I guess so in thinking about that, you know, I don't presume that there'd be, you know, a consistent range of outcomes or follow-up steps. You know, I think there's some families that are very happy about going back to in-person. I think there's a whole range of families very happy about staying with that home learning. And I think there's some who don't have a choice and are being forced, depending on their circumstances, to make one decision as part of that. So I think it's really important to be going back to our own feelings about that on the parent caregiver side. And again, talking with kids about what that means for us as a family, kind of moving forward. And to provide some of that space there for that whole range of feelings, whether it be about excitement and nervousness and being very happy about that, but also some of the loss and grief and disappointment as part of that too.
Yeah, thank you, Colin, for that. Are there any positives that might come from working through these types of situations or working through a crisis such as this? Will we have more resilient children or students as a result of this? Will we be more resilient adults as a result?
Yeah, great question. It's one I've been thinking about a lot. You know, I do know that this pandemic, as we talked about, has had some really disproportionate effects on different groups and individuals. And there's some new statistics out yesterday about increase in the severity and frequency of domestic violence during this time. And that's an outcome that we, unfortunately, we knew we would expect, and we knew it might be coming as a result of the pandemic. So I think it's important to really acknowledge the very difficult circumstances and traumas that have come out, that will come out of this for many different students and parents and caregivers as part of that. But on the flip side, I think for some of those kids and families that this has been a tough go, and, you know, what have we learned about maybe ourselves, about our coping during this time. And I think this is one where, you know, if we put a pin in today, or maybe before the first day of school, September 7th or September 13th, and we come back to it, you know, 3 weeks later at the end of September and reflect on, you know, where we're at that point. I think for many of us, you know, we might be surprised of how we've been able to manage some of this uncertainty, and to learn that maybe we are a little bit stronger, maybe in some ways that we maybe haven't anticipated. You know, I think about how much we've accomplished so far into this pandemic, and, you know, if someone had told me 5.5 months ago that I'd still be working from home with 2 young kids, right, I might have just packed it up then and there. But, by taking each day, you know, one step at a time and celebrating some of the small wins, and some of the new learning that comes from that, not just for kids, but for families too, is that we can do difficult things. We can have these feelings and be stressed and be uncertain and continue to move forward in small positive ways. So I'm really hopeful that for many of us anyways, that we can hold on to those learnings, that we can do tough things even if they feel a little bit scary in the moment.
Yeah. Colin, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. A couple of takeaways that are lodged in my mind, just to reiterate, is the importance of acknowledging where we are, is discerning between a problem and a worry, and also discerning between something that we might just be thinking about and something that's interfering. And that we might navigate those two pieces very differently. It's really important to take some time out as parents and educators to get a pulse of where we are, and to consider how our own feelings might be impacting how we're interacting with others in the world, and in particular kids. And then just slowing down and taking the time to listen to our students and children around their concerns, because there's so much benefit to be able to just simply acknowledge where they are. That in itself is a huge strategy in feeling validated and heard, and feeling like you can move forward despite having those worries and concerns. So it sounds like having some routines where possible is also really valuable, and giving both ourselves and our children a sense of control where we can, to counterbalance all of the uncertainty that we're navigating from day to day. And then just remembering all of the things that we've already done and practiced, and layering it onto the context that we are in right now as we transition back to learning. And I guess last, that there are really no right answers, that we're all in this, that having a sense of community, sharing with other people, combining resources are also really good strategies on navigating something that's just brand new for all of us.
So I think we're all going to need a healthy dose of kindness and compassion during these first several weeks. And I think kids do well if they can, but parents and educators also do well if they can too. And I think we're going to make it through together as we navigate all these uncertainties.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. As a reminder, this recording will go up very shortly on the Western Alumni webpage, and it will accompany Colin's very generous and robust list of resources that you might want to check out as well. Thanks again, and have a great day. Good luck, everyone.